Thank you. Today I'm going to be talking about one of the oldest technologies, what I think some important aspects of the adaptive significance, one of the oldest technologies, and this is the Oldowan. All right, named after Olduvai Gorge, right? So Lewis and Mary Leakey were the ones who actually did the initial type description of this technology, but it's been found over a big geographic area, and there's newer and interesting research happening all the time in this topic. I did want to say, though, that F. Clark Howell has a special place in my heart. I wasn't one of his students, but when I was a student, he always took time to talk with me. There were multiple meetings where I'd just be standing outside, and he'd be smoking a cigarette, and we'd be talking. And I sent him a copy of my dissertation when I finally finished, and actually was surprised when I visited his memorial library that it was still there, and he had, it was in his library with his books, and he had the cover letter that I put in it, and he really gave me a lot of good advice, and he was a good mentor, even though I wasn't one of his students. So I appreciate that I'm giving this talk today. Technology is key to human survival. Humans are a technologically dependent species. So humans live all over the world in all sorts of circumstances, and it's culture and technology that allow them to survive. We've adapted and created our own environments, our own habitats in urban settings, like in San Francisco. And technology even allows humans to go places where no person has gone before, right? And replicate what you see on Star Trek, going out into space. And TV shows like Naked and Afraid are very popular because you get to see humans dropped with no technology and no clothes out in the middle of nowhere and just see how they cope. And there's some macabre fascination with just seeing how people deal with like horrific circumstances. But what do they do in the end? They're always coming up with primitive technology that help them get food, and they've got to come up with fire, right, which is technology as well. We are a technologically dependent species, and the human gut is adapted to easy to digest nutritious foods. And humans, and paired with that is cooking, right? Cooking's really important as part of the human adaptation. And food sharing is a really huge component of all of this as well. So as a package, humans are adapted to a high quality diet of nutrient-rich foods. They food share liberally, and the human gut and our anatomy reflects this. This is not just true of people living in westernized societies. This is true also among foraging peoples. They're also eating high quality foods, often sharing them in their environment. Foods that often take some technology in order to acquire. So the Hadza, for example. Are you talking about the Hadza tonight, or are you? Yeah. So you'll hear more about it from someone who actually knows a lot more about it than I do. But the Hadza are eating a variety of really high quality foods. Tubers, baobab fruit, berries, honey. These are all high quality foods that are consumed, some of which are shared within the groups. And sharing is a really important part of risk mitigation. So if you're going to rely on technology to get high quality foods, then often food sharing is a component of that whole package. And human brain expansion changes over time. Humans' brains, hominin brains got bigger as we went through the Pliocene and Pleistocene. And that's, when you think about changes in diet, that's all of that brain expansion is being driven by changes in either dietary quality or the way food is being processed and prepared. So it's either improving the kind of foods that are being eaten or having better technology for preparing or cooking those foods. And that's what's key during the course of human evolution for increasing brain size through time, from Australopithecus to Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. The brain's a very metabolically expensive organ, and the story of human evolution is really a story of not only of brain expansion and cognitive ability improving, but also of dietary change over time. So the Oldowan technology is of interest to me because, it's the oldest persistent and widespread technology. So there is a slightly older technology from West Turkana called the Lamequian, which has been a little bit controversial, but in fact I think 100% that it's it's a real technology. It is 3.3 million years old. I've seen some of the artifacts. I've sat down with Sonia Harmond and looked at them. But it's very different than the Oldowan. And so I'm not even going to talk about it here. I'm just going to talk about the Oldowan. The Oldowan's the first technology that you find for a very long period, hundreds of thousands of years. It's the first technology that spreads from one region in East Africa across Africa and then ultimately out of Africa. So in terms of adaptive significance, the Oldowan seems like it potentially is very, very important. And that's why I've been interested in investigating it. And basically how Oldowan technology works is you've got the systematic production of flakes. Often it's from two-hand hard hammer percussion where you've got the hammerstone hitting a core, knocking a flake off. You can also do something called bipolar percussion where you basically use a hammer and anvil to knock flakes off of a core. Or you can even just take the core and smash it against a big rock and knock flakes off of that way. Anyway, a big component of the Oldowan is producing flakes. These flakes, basically, you're turning rocks into Swiss Army knives. And these flakes can then be used for a variety of tasks. And this is a rhetorical question. I've just mentioned some of these things. It is the best documented early technology. It may reflect an adaptive shift, right? There's a gap. I mean, there's not as much evidence of activities going on at the very early Oldowan sites. So much of what we know about the Oldowan is from later sites in this time interval, from sites that are about 2 million years old or younger. But the Oldowan does go back much earlier in time. Is it a reflection of dietary change? Is there some sort of socio-ecological change going on? How much food sharing is going on at these early archaeological sites? And you definitely know that activities are being restructured across the landscape because you've got the formation of accumulations of material that wasn't geologically observable earlier in time. So you actually have the formation of accumulations of stone tools and bones at specific points in the landscape. And this is one of the hallmarks of these early archaeological sites. So if you look, this is just something that was off the Smithsonian's website. If you look at technological milestones, and the dating of these milestones change over time as finds change. But you can see that when you look during the time interval of the Oldowan from about 2.6 to 1.7, the Oldowan is the persistent tool technology, so that's why you've got it starting at 2.6. It's during the time interval of the Oldowan you actually get hominids moving out of Africa. It's starting around 2 million years ago, you've got much better evidence of persistent butchery. So, some people have questioned how much hominids were actually butchering animals and eating meat earlier in time at the very oldest Oldowan sites. Perhaps they were actually focused more on plant materials, and there's a shift more towards butchery over time. And of course, again, with this idea of butchery, megafaunal butchery doesn't really show up historically until about 1.8, or prehistorically, until about 1.8 million years ago. I'm going to show you some sites that actually alter some of these dates because we've been working on Oldowan sites, new sites that are 2.6 million years old at some places on the Homa Peninsula. Who made the Oldowan tools? Well, if you could tell me, I'd appreciate knowing. We know that Homo ergaster is almost certainly making Oldowan tools. That's the first, that is the toolkit that Homo ergaster starts out with, and leaving Africa and going to Dmanisi and places like that, those are essentially Oldowan tools. Most people, would agree that Homo habilis is making Oldowan tools as well, but the time range of the Oldowan overlaps with many, many different species and even genera of hominins. Some late surviving Australopithecus species. Australopithecus sediba, Australopithecus gari. You've got Paranthropus. There's been an undercurrent of people, or a minority opinion of people, that thinks Paranthropus may have been making some of the Oldowan tools, or making some of the Oldowan sites. And Paranthropus overlaps, and in fact, Paranthropus is often found at Oldowan sites. You've like the Zinjanthropus level at Olduvai Gorge, which is one of the best studied Oldowan occurrences ever, had a Zinjanthropus, had a Paranthropus boisei fossil there. So you have this association of Paranthropus and the Oldowan going back, historically to some of the earliest excavations where hominids are being found at archaeological sites. So I don't know. I mean, I think probably it's almost certainly more than one hominin, and it could be that even different genera. So you could actually have a different genus making artifacts and sites at 2.6 million years ago, though there is Homo now back to 2.8. So often the unspoken assumption is that it's Homo, but Paranthropus is always like peeking its head out of the closet saying, don't forget about me.
Could you remind us which one of those worthies is Paranthropus?
So the left two. So here's Paranthropus boisei, and this is Paranthropus robustus. So Paranthropus has got really big face, really big jaws, an anatomical emphasis on chewing. All right. So and you know, Homo in general has got large, you know, for the specimens we've got crania for, have generally somewhat larger brain cases and teeth that are much bigger than ours, early Homo, but still reduced in size relative to Paranthropus. So the oldest Oldowan tools for as far, you know, for as long as I've been doing paleoanthropology, from the time I was a student, have been found in the Afar Triangle in Ethiopia. And this has been pretty stable for decades, right? The Gona, in fact, was the place that everyone talked about as being the oldest Oldowan site. And more recently, David Braun published on Ledi Gararu that has got Oldowan tools that are a couple of years older than the Gona. So the oldest, but they're close, very close to each other. So this region of Ethiopia seems to have been the source place of the Oldowan, or that's the way it seemed in terms of where the first appearance datum is. And it's not until between 2.3 and 2.4 million years ago, so hundreds of thousands of years later, that you start seeing Oldowan sites in other parts of Africa. So Clark Howell worked in the Omo, and he found some Oldowan sites that went back to 2.3 million years ago. West Turkana, Hadar, Ain Butcherit, Mohammed Zanuni found an Oldowan site that goes back to 2.4. That was a big range expansion, actually. That was published just a couple of years ago, or maybe 3 or 4 years ago now. I think it was pre-COVID. So you know, there is some movement. Sites are starting to move across Africa, but it took hundreds of thousands of years before this happened in terms of the archaeological record. And then the broadening of the site distribution increases even more over time. So by the time you get to sites that are about 2.2 to 1.7 million years old, you know, the older ones all over Africa, North Africa, South Africa, East Africa, Georgia, and by 2.1 million years ago, probably China as well. So it's in the later portion of the Oldowan time range that you seem to have the big range expansion. Right? Is this related to Homo ergaster, or the immediate ancestor of Homo ergaster and Homo erectus, African Homo erectus? That's what some people would say. All right, I work on the Homa Peninsula, so I work in a region that's kind of out of the way. I like it that way because, you know, there's so many places in the paleoanthropological world where there are conflicts and different researchers are kind of vying for influence and vying for sites. And the Homa Peninsula is cool because we can just go there and do research. And it was a very difficult place to work initially because nothing was known about the stratigraphy or the dating. It's got a special kind of volcano called a carbonatite volcano that doesn't produce crystals that you can argon-argon date. So dating's always a pain in the ass. But the sites are really rich there. And over time, we've been able to build up a record that includes some Oldowan sites. So I'm going to talk about the Homa Peninsula. So the Homa Peninsula is this peninsula out into Lake Victoria. We actually have 4 Oldowan site localities that we know about. I'm going to talk about 2 of them today. I worked at Kanjura first. I worked there about 20 years from 1995 to 2015. And then starting around 2015, I started working at this new site called Nyayanga. I'm actually going to talk about Nyayanga first, though, because I'm working there more recently, and we've made some interesting finds there. All right, so that carbonatite volcano you can see is the bright green in the middle of the peninsula. It produces rocks that hominids can and did use for stone tools, but the rocks are very poor quality. They're soft, they don't fracture well. And this sets up a dynamic, what I love is natural history experiments, where if you could actually imagine something and set up a distribution of resources and then see how the hominids reacted to that, it would be really cool, but you can't do that. You just have to work with what you've got. Well, in this case, we actually got in a very interesting scenario because on the Homa Peninsula, the carbonatite volcano, I curse it because it's hard to date, but I always go back to it because it produced crappy raw materials for the hominins, and the raw materials off the peninsula are much, much better. So you can see what hominin decision making was like in terms of transport behavior and the flaking of these different raw materials. Oh, and Louis Leakey worked at Canberra before he went to Oldowan. So I'm actually working with early records that go back to Leakey's time frequently when I'm working at Canberra. In fact, we just found the first in situ baboons from the Therapithecus oswaldi type site that Louis had collected from this last summer. We got it's radioactive and it's green, and it's a baboon butt. It's an articulated pelvis with vertebra. So there's still nice finds being made in places that Louis worked.
Where did you get that photo?
It's from Virginia Morell's book, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, Ancestral Passions. So this is Nyayanga. Nyayanga is an interesting place. It's got a long ravine or gully that goes, I don't know, half a kilometer or so. And then it expands out into a little amphitheater area. And here's Lake Victoria. So it's right on the edge of Lake Victoria. It's a beautiful place to work. You're sitting there, excavation, you just look up and you see fishing boats out on the lake. It's very picturesque. And this fault, the little gully that's here actually is running along a fault line. And streams ran along the fault. And those streams actually deposited the sediments that preserved the fossils and stone tools that we're excavating today. So here's the little amphitheater area. You can see the gully alongside it, right? It gets pretty deep as it's going close to the lake. And this is actually the channel section, cross section. So you can see it's a pretty substantial channel that was laying down sediments. And the sediments we're working on are lateral overbank deposits that have materials that were buried. The hominids would have carried out various activities and then they were buried by the fluvial system. And this happened for a fairly long time. And there initially what we found were Oldowan artifacts, which got us interested in the site. But unlike a lot of early Oldowan, I'm sort of letting the cat out of the bag. This is an early Oldowan site. Unlike a lot of the other early Oldowan sites, there's pretty good fossil preservation here. So we have fossil pigs, which help with the dating, fossil equids. Right, you don't have the modern equid. This is a site that's older than the modern equid. These are three-toed equids, right? The modern equids don't get to Africa until about 2.3 million years ago. You've got a lot of Dinotherium, which are a giant, very nasty proboscidean, unrelated to the living elephants in Africa today. Saber-toothed cats, some other kind of cat that was as big as a lion. Giant crocodiles. This is Croczilla. So we don't have a whole skull, so I can't identify it taxonomically, but from the size of the tooth, it was an enormous crocodile. And the first Paranthropus, the first hominin found in southwestern Kenya. So Louis Leakey had found some very controversial hominins in the Homa Peninsula. They're all Homo sapiens stuff. This is the first demonstrably ancient hominin, and this is actually the biggest hominin tooth ever found. It's an upper molar, it's an upper second molar, it's a Paranthropus. And I mean, we don't have the skull, but it has all the hallmarks of a Paranthropus tooth, so we're calling it Paranthropus spa. And there are a bunch of different primates. There are galagos and at least 3 different kinds of monkeys. And when we did the biostratigraphy, the magnetostratigraphy, some different dating methods, cosmogenic dating and apatite dating. All of the dates were falling within this interval, in the magnetostratigraphic interval between 2.59 and 3.05 million years ago, which fits perfectly with the fauna. Now there's some suggestions that this site's actually older than 2.6, that it's actually towards the end of the earlier part of this time range, which is really significant. But I'm not going to say that until we actually I'm going to get some more dates, because that would put it older than anything that's been found before, and I want to be absolutely sure of that before we say that. So all I'm saying now is that it's in the time interval between 2.59 and 3.05. So that by itself was interesting. Even if we had found nothing else, just having an Oldowan site of that age outside of the Afar Triangle is significant, because that expands the earliest Oldowan by more than 1,300 kilometers. So now, at the very beginning of the Oldowan, as soon as you seem to have the technology appear, it's no longer just in this little spot in Ethiopia. It's over a much bigger area of East Africa. And I think that probably there's been tremendous sampling error. I think the Oldowan may very well have been much more widely distributed than people realized. And people really need to look at these earlier time ranges. People are starting to look now because they're interested in the Lemequian and how widespread the Lemequian is. But I imagine they're going to find some older Oldowan sites as well. And the bones are pretty well preserved in places. So you have things like cut marks on bones. You could see the hominins were using the flakes they were producing to take meat off the bone. And this same bone has percussion damage as well. So this it was either a humerus, it was either the upper forelimb bone, or the upper bone from the lower limb. This was split open for marrow too. So this was both defleshed and demarrowed. And here's a scapula with cut marks on it, and you have lots of muscles attaching to the base of the spine in the scapula, and that's where they were cutting to get the meat off. And you don't want to just find things in the surface. You want to find things in situ. That's if you're finding enough material that it seems like it's worth the time to put excavations in, then you put excavations in. So we had some hippo bones and artifacts eroding out where excavation 3 was. So I put an excavation there, and then there was some elephant teeth eroding out at excavation 5. So I put an excavation up there as well. And I work with a big field crew. When we have funding, we hire 50 or 60 people. And a lot of them are sieving, some of them are digging trenches, and then we have a bunch of people who've been working with me since 1995 that are really good, much better excavators than me now. All right, so the 2 excavations I'm going to talk are both in the basal bed, so the oldest bed at Nyanga, excavation 3 and excavation 5. I'm going to talk about excavation 3 first. We got isolated bones and artifacts, and then we hit a layer with hippo bones. And this is a skeleton of a hippopotamus. And we started finding more artifacts with the hippo. And then we got below the hippo, and there weren't as many artifacts. So the artifacts really looked like they're concentrated with the hippopotamus skeleton. But it's a partial hippopotamus skeleton. And if you think about a hippo, it's a very big thing. But the hippo just ended very abruptly. And that's because I don't dig anywhere that's not complicated. So what happened is there was a fault ran right through the excavation and downfaulted half the hippo, about a meter and a half. So we were just working with part of the hippo when we were doing the initial excavations. And that part had nice flakes associated with it. All right, just pictures of flakes right next to or on top of bones. So in really tight spatial association. And also some pounding tools. And this is something else that's really unusual about Nyanga. Everyone focuses on flakes because they're interested in butchery. And people, butchering animals is very sexy. For some reason, eating tubers is not less sexy, though it's probably more important a lot of the time. So we found a lot of pounding tools at Nyanga, tools that weren't flaked, as cores. They were just being used for pounding. And several of them came out of this excavation 3. And they show a lot of pounding damage. We pick up the cobbles of the same raw materials, and we do actualistic experiments with them. And the degree of pounding damage you have in this would take hours to develop. So the hominins were doing a lot of pounding. They're not only and many of the cores will have flakes off on one side, and then the butts will show pounding damage on them. So they were using them for both flaking to produce flakes as well as pounding tools. So pounding was definitely important here. And there's more pounding damage in these lithics than in any Oldowan site that's been found so far. I think partly this is because people aren't looking for pounding damage enough, and I think as people start looking for it more, they're going to see more pounding damage in some of the older assemblages that have been studied. So we got this hippopotamus with this fault running through it. And you know, what we finally did is we just kept digging down on the side that the fault was, and ultimately about a meter and a half down, we found the hippopotamus again. So I was able to reconstruct the skeleton, put the whole thing that had sadly been separated back together again. And at this level, again, once you hit the hippo, you started getting artifacts. And you know, so here's a hippo scapula with a flake right next to it again. And here's a bone that's got, the bone unfortunately from this hippo is not super well preserved. This is a rib. There's calcium carbonate in the rib, so it shows it's an ancient mark, that it's not a recent mark. And there are linear striations in it. These are little lines that you can see coming out of the groove here that stone flakes leave when they're being dragged across the bone. So this to me looks like even though it's a crappy preservation, this looks like a stone tool cut mark on one of those hippo bones. And we found another hominin in situ, which is not very common. And this was the last day of the season in 2017, and there was a big thunderstorm, and I was afraid my graduate student was going to get hit by lightning because she was standing with the transit out in the middle of an open exposed area. So we were trying to lift things all of a sudden, and I finally got to this tooth because I hadn't seen it before, and it was a hominin. I mean, even I could see it was a hominin. And it's another paranthropus tooth. So not only did we have a paranthropus in situ, but we had a paranthropus at the Oldowan site. So again, this association between the paranthropus and Oldowan is kind of interesting. So I don't know what to make of that, because I never thought paranthropus would be making Oldowan tools, but we do keep finding paranthropus fossils at Oldowan sites. So that's kind of interesting. And then we also excavated at excavation 5, and luckily our geological trench ended just above these beautiful hippo bones. It's another hippo scatter, and these bones are better preserved than the excavation 3 bones. And it's just a pile of hippo bones in this one spot in a silt. So this isn't as if water would have dropped them there, because they're in a very fine sediment. And you've got a hippo innominate, you've got a scapula. So this is coming from the forelimb. You've got a calcaneus and a tibia coming from the hind limb. So it's a mix between forelimb and hind limb elements. And there's some artifacts there as well. There's a cobble and there was a flake. And when we flipped the tibia over and actually looked at it in the lab, we found cut marks on the anterior crest, which is where muscles attach to the shin bone. So again, this is actually anatomically exactly where you'd expect if a hominid was butchering a hippo. This is one of the spots you'd expect there to be cut marks. So it's rare enough to get one large mammal butchery site. I've only had one other large mammal butchery site, in my career. But here in one or two seasons, we got 2 large mammal butchery sites. And this year we dug below the hippo at excavation 3. And just before the season ended, we found an elephant bone. So that, elephant bones don't move far from the dust site. So I was hoping to just backfill that excavation and forget about it. But I may have to dig it some more, because an elephant butchery site would be really cool. And then that would be the oldest megafaunal butchery site in the world. So it shows that at the very early sites, hominids were in fact butchering even the biggest animals on the landscape, all right, which is not something that people realized based on what had been found up to that point. Also, the lithics are really interesting. The technology is really interesting. I've got a student she's not a student of mine anymore. She's now a curator at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, but she's got the very cool name of Emma Finestone. And Herman's worked with her. So very, very appropriate for someone who does lithic technology. And she's been doing the analysis of the Nyayanga artifacts. And what's cool about them is that in terms of technologically, they're flaked just as proficiently as Oldowan sites much later in time. But unlike most Oldowan sites where the artifacts are being made, where the napping is going on just a few meters away from where the stone is being picked up, these stones are traveling. They're actually walking around with these stones. So 10 or 11 kilometers, maybe 12 kilometers to pick up stones and actually carrying them to Nyayanga. And again, for an early Oldowan site, this is really unusual. Most of the early sites are literally right next to where the sources are. And there are a lot of raw materials that are coming from, we've done big raw material surveys around the peninsula. They have to be coming from about 12 kilometers away. So if you look at the Homa Peninsula, and you look at the actual primary sources of some of the raw materials. I mean, the quartzite's coming from, I think, 90 kilometers away, ultimately, the primary source, and it's coming down stream channels and rivers that ultimately bring it towards Lake Victoria from the Kisi Highlands. And then the Nyanzayan rhyolite's coming a little bit closer, but it's still tens of kilometers away. And these materials, are being carried there by water. So they're often rounded cobbles by the time the hominins get them. And, they can't actually get onto the peninsula because the peninsula is, it rose up like a giant pimple in the face of the Homa Peninsula, and it affected the elevation. So the artifacts, the raw materials are going to the north or south of the Homa Peninsula, wrapping around it towards Lake Victoria. And the hominids had to be going to those conglomerates that were, off, 12 kilometers away to pick up the cobbles. And what's cool now, when you're thinking about the battering damage and cobbles being used for pounding, is that everybody thinks that cobbles are being picked up and only being used for flaking. And again, some of these cobbles were not flaked at all, but they were used for hours in pounding. And I think there's actually some directed transport. They're actually going out and picking up, and it's the quartzite cobbles, the cobbles that are of the hardest raw material. The hominins are picking up really hard cobbles, and in advance of carrying out pounding tasks, and they're actually walking them out to Nyanga, and they're there are resources in that area of Nyanga that the hominids are actually pounding, spending a lot of time pounding. So this might actually be sort of an example of advanced planning. That's not something you would see, at non-human primate sites, this degree of transport, as well as, it's clear that they weren't collecting the cobbles for flaking because they never flaked them. They just use them for pounding and then they discard them. So what are the tools being used for? We've done, a lot of experiments. So that we've done use-wear, and we've done experiments both with flakes and with the cobbles, and working a variety. So the material that we've used. We sent flakes of some of the raw materials, so the same raw materials that were used at Kanjara, and Hadza women actually peeled tubers and cut tubers, some of the wild tubers they used with our raw materials, so we had tuberware on them. And in the end, doing the analysis of the archaeological specimens and comparing them to the yardstick that you created, the reference you created from all these experiments, it looked like the hominids were using flakes and pounding tools on a similar array of materials, a lot of plant materials, as well as butchery. So for the pounding, they're pounding both hard and soft plant materials, as well as bones. And then with the cutting, it's the same deal. It looks like they're peeling tubers, they're defleshing carcasses, and it's both a combination of plant and animal processing going on. So we now know at the earliest Oldowan, which we didn't know before this site, that at least at some sites, the Oldowan tools are being used for an array of foodstuffs, just like they are later in time. And that as soon as the Oldowan appears, it's being used to extract food from a variety of places. So, Nyanga, I just put this up just because I think this is really cool and it's not been published yet. I've got an article under review in Science for this, so hopefully it'll get published. But, it's older than 2.6. It's a big range expansion for the Oldowan. Was the Oldowan more widespread early on? Strong raw material selectivity. They really like the hard raw materials. They're transporting those hard raw materials over kilometers, whereas at most early Oldowan sites, they're just walking feet for them, and that's because at most Oldowan sites, the raw material is better. There's evidence for megafaunal butchery, as well as other animals being butchered, and the processing of tubers, fruits, and wood. And again, Paranthropus is associated with the Oldowan. And that's probably the oldest Paranthropus, in fact, and it's associated with the Oldowan. At Kanjara, I worked at Kanjara from 1995 to 2015. I sort of pulled a Mary Leakey, where I just decided to work in one place and actually excavate for a long period of time and do a really good job at it. I hope I did a good job at it. So this was I was comparing this to FLK Zinj, to the big site that Mary Leakey dug, the FLK Zinjanthropus site. I wanted to get a sample of material that we could compare to the FLK Zinj assemblage. It's a little bit older than Zinj, but not too much older. So we worked there from 95 to 2015. The bone is pretty well preserved. You get a variety of animals. But this slide shows what we often found. We found a lot of antelopes, especially goat-sized or smaller antelopes at this site. But there are bigger animals too, like zebra, like proper zebra, as well as the three-toed kind. And there are flakes as well. And this was deposited in fine silts and sands through a 3-meter sequence. So the hominids are going back over and over and over again to this one spot, much more so than we saw at Nyanga. There's something attracting them there to this spot over tens of years or even hundreds of years. And if you look at the distribution of fossils and artifacts, in this case, red is the fossils and blue is the artifacts. And then this is just a cross section, through the 3 meters of sequence. They were going back over, and there was a lot of material deposited here over a pretty decent time interval. So there's something attracting them to this spot. This isn't a place they're living. This is what Kathy Schick would call a favored place, right? There's some resources really, attracting them, and they're just going back over and over and over again to this spot. And there, again, is a really interesting archaeological story. Basically, what we saw at Nyanga, we actually saw first at Canberra, where there's these same crappy raw materials locally at Canberra, like limestone and carbonatite. But there's some nice raw materials, like the granite, like the quartzite, like the felsite, like the chert, that are about 13 kilometers away, actually on the other side of the peninsula. So we've moved to the north of the peninsula now. And again, the hominids were transporting about a third of the assemblage were these nicer raw materials that were coming from about 13 kilometers away. So the hominids definitely had appreciation for raw material physical qualities. And we've done material sciences tests on these. I'm just not showing any of that. They definitely preferred very hard rocks, which are good for both pounding, like we saw at Nyanga, but also for cutting. 1 flake of quartzite, you can skin a whole antelope with just 1 flake of quartzite. From our experiments, it would be like 10 flakes of limestone to do the same thing. So it makes a big difference to have the hard, good quality raw material, and the hominins appreciated that. There are all sorts of animals found at Canberra. I mean, the most common thing, though, were the antelopes. How am I doing on time? Do I have to pick up the pace? Oh, what time did I start?
A little after 1.
All right, so let me pick up the pace. Sorry. All right, I just got into it. So there are a lot of small animals here. A lot of small antelopes. A lot of them are juveniles. All right, it's a very open setting. Canberra is the most open setting of any Oldowan site. It's a very grassy environment, and they're catching a lot of small antelopes and a lot of babies. All right, you're not going to scavenge small antelopes in an open setting. There's nothing to scavenge after a large carnivore eats them. That's a good lunch picture. You compare it to FLK Zinj. FLK Zinj is formed in a woodland. This is the site that Mary Leakey excavated that lots of people have looked at since. And in woodlands, you can ambush prey like leopards do. And if you look at the mortality profiles of leopard prey, they're killing more adults than carnivores that are killing prey in open country, because the juveniles are the real disadvantaged ones, and they're easier to catch in open country. An adult can see a predator and get away in the more open settings. And if you look at the mortality profile of the Zinj fauna versus the Canberra fauna, Canberra, they're catching, I think they're hunting small antelopes. They're getting complete carcasses and they're walking them back and butchering them at the site. The medium carcasses, I think, the bigger things, wildebeest-sized things, I think, are being scavenged a lot of the time, though. At Oldowan, it looks like they're even butchering, hunting, or getting early access to some of the bigger fauna. And I think that's because, and the argument that people like Manuel Dominguez Rodrigo has used, is that they're actually able to ambush prey in the woodlands. So I think we're starting to see, if you get enough sites with fine enough resolution, you can start doing behavioral comparisons that integrate some of the habitat information you've got into the hominid behavior. All right, so in terms of Canberra, it's the same deal. Butchery. This is from the use where and the archaeology. Underground storage, organ processing. woodworking, and also cutting herbaceous plants, which, you can actually do a lot with herbaceous plants in terms of technology. So it'd be interesting to know what they were doing with that. At FWJJ20, the cool thing there is that they're using aquatic resources. So this is about the same age as Canberra, but they're eating, they've butchered some turtles, some fish, some crocodiles. You don't see that at many other sites. So if you look at the earliest Oldowan, it may have been broadly distributed at its first appearance. So these are sites that are really old. Used to process a range of plant and animal foods early on, including megafauna. These are packets that are large enough to share, though if you're all around a hippo, you don't really have to share. You can just cut off your own piece. The transport dynamics are not like chimpanzees in terms of some of the raw materials that are being moved around, and there's a lot of pounding activity, which I think is underappreciated archaeologically. For the later Oldowan, Oldowan hominids are using tools to get, and this is comparing Canberra and Zinj and Kubifora, grasslands, woodlands, aquatic habitats. There is, some energetic investment. They are moving, under certain circumstances, moving raw material, especially if there's a big disparity in the quality of raw materials. They're moving the better quality raw materials across the landscape. They may be making tools with tools, which is cool, right? Making wooden tools. I think if they're hunting, they're probably having, sharpening a stick is not that big a deal. And a simple spear is essentially just a sharpened stick. And they're utilizing high quality foods like animal tissue and tubers. So, I think in terms of thinking about the questions that I posed early in the talk, it could be that by 2 million years ago, you're starting to get the beginnings of tool-dependent foraging. It's maybe not as clear earlier on, but certainly it may be seasonally important throughout the whole Oldowan. It could be seasonally critical to have lithics. I don't know whether it's critical year-round. If you look at the package of information, this is more than sort of incidental tool use. I think tools have become really important to hominid lifeways during the time interval of the Oldowan. And that's it. Thank you very much.